Hello, Nebraska. This is Ben Buckner from Ag Resource Company. Sorry I couldn't be there with you in person or even online, but it's still a pleasure to again present at the Mid-Plains annual meeting. And so we'll get right into it. And I know that 2019 was a very challenging year for the Midwest farmer. And unfortunately, the outlook that we have for 2020 and perhaps beyond is not terribly bright. But this macro outlook and the general theme in 2020 is difficult for us as well, but we think it's important to acknowledge that rather than ignore it. We think that marketing crops will be imperative in 2020 and beyond, and so it's important to be very proactive on spring and summer rallies. There will be opportunities for profitability. We just need to be very, very diligent about keeping that in mind. So the major themes for 2020 and beyond are: we see widespread or maximum use of GMO corn and soybeans in the U.S. That's been known for a long time, but now what we've seen is that this is providing a roadmap or a template for the rest of the world, particularly our enemies in South America and Russia and Ukraine. And so they're getting better at producing crops because they are still profitable. And so this cycle of expanding global production area continues. Peak arable land probably is not hit until 2030 or maybe even 2040. And yield growth is still accelerating in the Black Sea and South America. We think that this will continue over the next decade, or at least until the U.S. dollar undergoes a major correction, which again we don't see in the next couple of years. We've already seen crops there have become more immune to adverse weather events. And there's not this mechanism to slow this cycle down. Usually it's cheap Chicago prices, oversupply, but then there's not the incentive to expand production, and so the market corrects itself when we go through these cycles. But what's the main issue now is that even despite 380, 350 Chicago corn farmers in Ukraine and Russia, in Brazil and Argentina are still making money. So they still have incentive to expand area and invest in resources in terms of their own crops and farms. So eventually, even Argentina and the Black Sea will have to find demand. There will be very, very steep competition for world trade, assuming normal weather over the next decade. And so that is what's been weighing on rallies. You'll notice that 474 was the best we could do despite terrible, terrible spring and even fall weather in the United States. And this is because we've been able to grow crops elsewhere. Argentina, Russia is right there to undercut us. And they're growing crops on a hemispheric basis. So if we have a problem this year, I want you all to keep in mind that Argentina and Brazil will start to plant a new corn crop in late September and October. So if the market goes up in Chicago this summer, we should fully expect additional area expansion in South America. And even sub-Saharan Africa, which is still projected to be a major net food importer over the next decade, is starting to find ways of maximizing yield or getting close to it. The movement of water is becoming more easier. That gives the farmer there more time to invest in their own farms, worry about markets, find new markets, and so it's just the beginning of a kind of snowball effect in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, we have the macro political influences. We have no way of knowing whether the world as it stands now, which is moving towards a series of bilateral trade agreements, so the U.S., Canada, Mexico, U.S., United Kingdom, U.S., China, and vice versa. This is happening all over the world. If that is good enough or can match or exceed what we've seen over the last several decades, which is multilateral trade agreements. Something close to global free trade. And we don't know which one is right or wrong or better or worse. We just know that it's changing. So we will need to pay close attention to the pace of global trade of everything moving forward. We also see Chinese GDP growth slowing. Part of this is due to coronavirus now, but even before that, India and the rest of Southeast Asia is emerging as the new global demand drivers. And so the bottom line is, as the rest of the world gets better at producing things, we don't have major global economic growth forecasts over the next decade. We need new demand drivers. And that's something that we don't see in 2020, especially. There's nothing like the U.S. biofuel mandate that we saw in 2005. Food consumption is growing because population is growing, but we don't really see per capita growth expanding over what's been seen over the last couple of years. So growth in global ag markets over the next 5, maybe even 10 years looks to just be very normal, kind of tepid, stagnant. We also see consumer preferences changes. This is a very long-term issue. But the arrival of oat milk, almond milk, sustainability practices, organic, and we don't get to decide what the consumer wants, neither I nor anyone in the room, but we just know that they're changing. So does the U.S. or world consumer want sustainably grown crops and food? And that seems to be probably something that will be accelerating over the next couple of years. And so we've got to adapt to that in the United States. We have the very best farmers and some of the most productive cropland in the world. The question is, what do we do with that land and that expertise? And over time, again, this is a very long-term issue. Do we need to be growing corn, soybeans, and wheat? Or is it other things, such as hemp? That's been a very good alternative crop for a lot of farmers in the U.S. and I think will be booming moving forward. And it may not be hemp, but other things that are sold in high-end grocery stores. I just want to plant the seed that things might need to change over the next 10 or 20 years. And again, because we have, for now, ended the bulk of the U.S.-China trade war, marketing crops in 2020 is going to be critical. We don't think the market facilitation program comes back. We're left with normal crop insurance and what the market gives us. And if we're looking at normal weather, we have oversupply and bearish trends probably longer term. Again, we will have opportunities, but we just want to be very, very proactive in taking advantage of those this spring and summer. So we start with, like we usually do, just very macro themes. What is the world economy doing? And the USDA actually on Friday highlighted this. They also highlighted this in a paper released a couple of weeks ago. So you'll see that emerging economies, advanced economies, and even the world, economic growth is very, very stagnant. Just under 4% for the world, just under 2% for advanced economies, and even emerging economies, growth is slowing. And the assumption that the USDA and a lot of the market is using is that pre-2007 growth does not return over the next 5 years. So the world economy continues to grow, more food will be eaten, incomes will be rising, but it's the rate at which they are rising that really keeps us in this pretty stagnant price trend longer term. Because what matches up with this is the change in the volume of total goods and services traded globally. This is everything from consulting to food to steel. We've just seen that post-2007, we had a recession in 2009, so it was very easy to rebound from that. But since then, it's just been very slow, very stagnant, not very impressive. And so the reason that we mention this is because corn and wheat and soybeans are part of the food cycle. Food is a good. A good is something that's traded. And so what you do in Nebraska is simply a part of the world economy. And the commodity indexes seem to match this and tell a pretty clear story. So in 2011, GDP growth of 4 to 5%, the value of the sum of the U.S. raw material market was very expensive. Since then, we've had world GDP growth of 3.3 to 3.4%, and we've seen that the trend in the broad commodity index has been very flat and somewhat weak. And so if GDP growth worldwide continues at 3 or 3.5%, we could have this same meeting and the same presentation in 2 or 3 years, and this chart would not change. It would just be very, very flat moving forward. And so again, we highlight the need for new demand drivers if we are to be bullish of agriculture longer term, or if we are to see prices outpace just general U.S. and world inflation. And we do have the need for greater food production, but the issue is that a lot of places that have been growing will no longer be growing in terms of population in the next 20 years. So what's highlighted here are sort of China and other emerged economies. Populations in Russia, Germany, and Japan by 2040 will be contracting, We will have about 566 million people added to Earth in sub-Saharan Africa, Pakistan, and India. And so this is where greater food production and consumption will be needed. But this is what we call a super cycle, so it's something that takes 10, 15, 20 years. It's not something that will be traded at the Board of Trade during the next crop cycle. It's just something that develops. This will inflate food prices longer term, but it's not something that will be a demand driver in the very near term. And so I mentioned world trade before. And again, I'm not saying that a series of bilateral trade agreements is worse than what we've seen. But since the formation of the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs in 1940, which eventually becomes the World Trade Organization, we've seen a lot of people lifted out of poverty, about 1 billion people. And this is quantifiable. So we really like this chart, and this makes us at AgResource a fan of just cheap global trade. That does reshuffle where things are produced and bought and sold and who's an importer and exporter. But in the context of food consumption, I think that lifting people out of poverty, the bottom 10% of incomes, giving them more disposable income moving forward will have a much greater effect on global food consumption than giving the top 10% additional income. So whether this is done through bilateral trade or multilateral trade, we want to see the number of people living in extreme poverty continue to decline, which will raise global food consumption. And so I don't know if the bilateral trade agreements will help or hurt this. We just want to highlight that it's changing, and there is some risk associated with change. And we've had a series of black swan events. The biggest food threat in China, and really the biggest threat to the leadership there, has been the spread of swine fever. And so just to put it into context, the drop in pork production from 54 million tons to 36 million tons forecast in 2020, that change is bigger than the entirety of world pork trade and world beef trade and world poultry trade. So it's been a sizable decline. China produces about 2/3 of the world's pork, so it was the very last place that a disease should happen. And so what this does is, of course, very quickly lowered the need for feed and feed protein in China. China was supposed to have imported in 2020 about 110 or 115 million tons of soybeans based on growth in imports we've seen over the last decade, but the arrival of swine fever has eliminated growth, and instead they will import probably 90 or 92 million tons of soybeans. So there's been a big impact on feed trade flows because of this. Now, this also does raise the need for food within China, and because of swine fever, we've seen this huge import margin develop. And we're all waiting on this acceleration in U.S. pork exports to China. I do note that pork sales to China are the highest they've ever been. It's just that they're not yet outpacing what we're producing. There are a lot of hogs, and there's a lot of room for additional pork production in the United States. But China's need for food is dire. And again, this is something that's quantifiable. So food inflation as of November was 16%. In December, it was 17%, and in January, it reached 24%. And so we think not only does this tell us that China needs food, but it's also a very long-term structural issue. And coronavirus is only making this worse. We're seeing reports of food shortages. Logistics are being affected. Transportation into China is being affected. There are a lot of vessels just waiting to offload food in China, but in the interior of the country, there's just a dwindling amount of food. So again, this is a crisis of leadership within China. And the last time that we saw anything like this was 2006 to 2009. In that period, China embarked on a multi-year strategy of raising meat, vegetable oil, and grain imports. So, of course, we do expect China to be a large buyer of U.S. pork, beef, dairy, to some extent grains and soybeans in 2020 and 2021. But this is bigger than that. Outside of the U.S. and Chinese Phase 1 agreement, China has a very, very acute need for food, and it's going to take several years for them to combat food inflation and for them to get back to normal inflation of 3 to 4%. And we're already seeing this happen. Latest official data as of November, multi-year high in Chinese total meat imports. And this is because you can make money importing meat, because China needs the meat. And so we think that in the next several months, really the next 6, 8, or 12 months, Chinese meat imports will routinely be between 450 and 600,000 tons. It's a sizable total. And again, the second black swan has been coronavirus. These charts are outdated, but the rate of infections and deaths over time, that they were mirroring things like swine flu in 2009 or SARS in the early 2000s. We knew this was going to be a big problem. I don't think this is going to kill us all. This is not the end of the world. This should probably peak by spring and summer. But it's simple arithmetic. Because of the cities that are being quarantined, because China is essentially on lockdown, especially central China, and because it's spreading into other places in East Asia and Europe and even Chicago, there will just be less money spent on travel and discretionary things. As of 2018, spending by Chinese travelers total, their contribution to the world economy was $275 billion. In 2019, we think this will inch up towards $300 billion. But in 2020, what will this number be? Will it be 220 billion? So there's just a very quantifiable loss of spending in East Asia. And already GDP growth in China and East Asia is being revised downward because of this. So again, this is not because this is the end of the world, but it does affect near and medium-term discretionary spending. So we highlighted already tepid global economic growth expected in the next few years. This is only making it worse, or preventing growth. And so because we have profitability in these other countries, no real demand story, and haven't seen one for a couple of years, what's happened is that we're now producing record tonnages of major crops outside of the U.S. And so, for example, again, the U.S. farmer had the most challenging spring in memory, and the fall was no different. But as the Chicago corn market started to rally during the summer, what caught our attention was the cash price of corn that Argentinian exporters were willing to sell to the world market was going down. So because there is so much major crop supply outside of the U.S., it really tempers our weather-based rallies. Global supplies will be adequate despite U.S. production shortfalls, unless there's just a crippling drought. And those of you in the room now that's been to Mid-Plains meetings before has seen this chart, but the reason that we continue to show it is because it's ongoing. The Argentine peso has only gotten weaker. So has the Australian dollar and the Canadian dollar. So it's pretty crazy to think about that the Argentine peso has only 8% of the value that it had in 2013. And so what this does, since commodities are still traded in US dollars, we've seen the price of corn at the Board of Trade drop 20% from June of 2014. This is bad news, but it is not news to anyone here. But the Brazilian price of corn, if we price it in Brazilian reais, it is up 56%. And so the price that the Brazilian farmer is seeing has only gone up since 2014. It's even more dramatic in Argentina. Board of Trade prices to the Argentine farmer are up 6 times from where they were in 2014. So again, there's no mechanism to slow continued growth of area and yields and production in South America and Russia and Ukraine, and to some extent, even Canada and Australia. And so because of that, we've got all of this profitability in these emerging markets. A lot of that money is going back into the farmers' own inputs and production. And so we're all familiar with Norman Borlaug, who revolutionized agriculture in India. And are we seeing a similar thing happen recently and continue into the next couple of years? And so if you look at this chart, you'll notice that the improvement in productivity has not been expanding irrigation or expanding ag land even, but it's just been total factor productivity. I think that includes seed traits, just simply better farming practices? Will there be a time when Ukraine and Brazil can plant the number of seeds per acre that we can in the U.S.? That has been the biggest driver of growth in yield in the U.S. and in Europe. And does that, again, provide a roadmap or template to these emerging markets? We've already seen this happen. The U.S. crop seemingly has been more immune to weather. 2017, the current record yield, we thought no way that we would get large ear weights or even a very sizable yield because it was simply too hot. This chart maps ear weights against July temperatures across the 10 biggest producing states in the U.S. But ear weights seemingly have deviated from this trend. And that's why even this year, and I know we're going to resurvey crops, and there's thoughts that everything has been overestimated, but let's call final actual yield in the U.S. 166 or 167. Given the spring, summer, and fall that we've had, I think that's still impressive. So the U.S. is getting very, very good at growing corn. It's even more dramatic in soybeans, where we've seen something happened in 2012. We had crippling drought, the worst weather in recent memory, yet we had pretty good pod weights in soybeans. And so we highlight this change from 2012, from pre-2012, and now just the soybean crop is getting better at weathering heat and dryness, late plantings, and so on. And we're still getting better and more efficient at growing things. Mid-Plains is a part of this. We're creating networks that allow the farmer to know what kind of seeds to plant in certain types of soil on this part of his farm versus that part of his farm. We're only going to be getting more efficient at growing things, and we are the best. But the issue or concern is that some of this stuff starts to spread into South America and Europe. I already know that they're creating things similar to networks in Europe and the United Kingdom. Precision agriculture, studying microclimates, that is starting to spread outside of the United States. The United States corn yield has been very good and grown 22% since the year 2000. And it's very difficult to grow yield when you're already, at trend, can grow 180 bushels per acre. But it's the marginal changes that we're watching most closely. So Ukraine corn yields since 2000 are up 140%. Russian corn yields are up 168%. So I think this shows that our farming practices, which are the best in the world, are starting to spread to other countries, which again are making money and growing arable land area. The same thing is in wheat. Our wheat growth is pretty good, but it pales in comparison to places like Ukraine and Russia, and even Canada. 2016 and 2017, we saw record Russian wheat crops, exceeded expectations by 5 million tons. We thought that things were changing then, but then going back and looking at weather during the growing season, it just seemed that it was very good. And so we can't separate yield from weather yet. It was very wet during the springs of 2016 and 2017. But then 2018 and 2019, we saw multi-year low levels of rainfall during Russian wheat growing season, yet yield was pretty steady and still at the upper end of history there. So what can Russian farmers grow in terms of wheat if weather is normal, if spring rainfall reaches 5 or 6 inches? The previous record in production is 84 million tons. Can they get to 88 million tons this year? We don't know. Weather still has a major impact on yield. But again, we're just highlighting this accelerating yield growth in foreign countries. And the safrinha crop in Brazil, which is planted in February and harvested in July, is very, very close to being planted after the seasonal rainy period ends there. So it can be a very dangerous crop to plant, and especially rely on if you're an exporter or an importer to or from Brazil. But even here we're seeing that, on the margin, technically, the state of Paraná in Brazil, a major safrinha producer, has been getting drier since 2010. Yet safrinha corn yields have only been going up. And so we have not yet reached maximum corn production potential in Brazil. And in the very near term, we will have avoided worst case scenarios in South America this year, We do still have to grow the safrinha corn crop, but in terms of first crop corn and soybeans, this is vegetation health index compared to average. There are some problems in Mato Grosso, which is highlighted, but for the most part, conditions are better than average. Harvest has started. Soybean yields so far have been variable, but lean toward levels 10 or 15% above last year, and so are record high. A very big Brazilian crop will be available to the world market within the next 4 or 5 weeks. And the same is true in Argentina. Argentina started this growing season very, very dry, and this map looked very, very different 6 weeks ago. But because of El Nino, we knew that everything probably was going to be fine. And in the last 6 weeks, it has rained exactly when and where it is supposed to. The forecast for the next 2 weeks has this very nice mix of rain and sun, so we think that vegetation health will only continue to improve into the very end of the month. Harvest will start in 2 or 3 weeks, beginning with early planted corn and soybeans. So South American crops will be large in 2020. And this is all pretty much known. We know that the Black Sea is growing more wheat, South America is growing more corn and soybeans, and that they're getting better at growing those things. But when we look at other places like Sub-Saharan Africa, which is blessed with normal rainfall patterns similar to those in North America and Europe, they can be more productive. This is a picture of a solar-powered water pump. This picture was sent to me 10 days after I met someone in Zambia, and I know someone who sells solar-powered water pumps to Sub-Saharan Africa. And so this picture was sent to me after it was purchased in just 10 days. I think it shows us the demand for new resources within Africa in terms of crop production. And we know that they could be 2 or 3 times more productive if the country can get organized, or the individual countries. Most of this is due to yield. And so as the movement of water gets easier and cheaper within Africa, and as cell phone use starts to rise within Africa, more time can be devoted towards growing crops. As of right now, it's just a matter of planting and harvesting a crop to avoid bankruptcy. But moving forward, can they spend more time doing other things, put more resources into their own crops? I think Sub-Saharan Africa will be a net food importer for a long time, but is this the beginning of a process to where South Africa, southern half of Africa, starts to compete as an exporter in the next decade? Something that we'll watch very, very closely. And so everything that we've talked about so far has just been a very, very long-winded way of saying that we're going to see markets look more like this. There will be premium added during weather problems, whether they happen in the United States or in Russia or in South America. But they will be very brief and sort of shallow in terms of how intense the rallies are because of adverse weather. Because again, we're growing crops in the northern and southern hemisphere now, big crops. If our corn yield has a shortfall, it will be replaced by South American corn in 6 months. If they have a production shortfall, the northern hemisphere will replace that 6 months later. And because we don't have major world demand growth, this is what we're looking for. And we think that this is very important to recognize. So as we get into the 2020 growing season, and let's say we start to have problems at planting, problems during pollination, the market will go up. But we want to be very proactive at selling at prices above break-even. The exporter wheat balance sheet is probably one of the brighter spots in 2020. This will help U.S. wheat as well. And so the next few slides will have a lot of numbers on it, but I just want to walk you through our thought process. So this assumes higher area in Russia, unchanged area everywhere else, trend yields. So we do grow exporter wheat production slightly in 2020, assuming normal weather. But also assuming trends in demand and trade, we're not going to grow the major wheat exporter balance sheet much. It is not going to expand. So stocks to use is still below where it was 2 years ago when we saw new crop Chicago wheat futures test $6. And so the wheat market, more so than the corn to soybean market, will be very, very sensitive to northern hemisphere weather over the next 90 days. And actually, we will need higher U.S. wheat acres in 2021. This will be accomplished by spreads more than flat price. So it's not an outright bullish outlook for wheat, but it's tough to be bearish Chicago wheat below $5 or $5.10 or so. But compare this to the U.S. and world corn supply and demand in 2020, the most probable scenario that we think. We know we're going to get new acres or returned acres in the United States. This is not new. But we just want to highlight what the balance sheet looks like, and this is very, very conservative. So I assume yields 174. We're going to get Chinese demand eventually. We'll be better competing in the world market as a whole, so exports rise to 2 billion bushels. But we're still left with about 2.5 billion bushels at the end of the crop year. And so to change this, we need a yield below 167 or so, or we need the loss of 3 or 4 million acres. So we need weather problems to be bullish corn. And as the growing season starts and these seasonal trends start to turn negative because of South America's harvest, the perception of this balance sheet by the market just needs to change significantly to prevent what we think is a 30 to 40 cent break in corn by late summer. And because we grow so much corn stocks in the United States, this has an impact on the world supply and demand. So major exporter corn stocks to use in the next crop year, assuming normal weather, reaches 14%, which we think could give us downside in December corn to 310 or 320. None of this happens very soon, but we do want to highlight the risks that we face. We want to keep those in mind as we get into the growing season, and as perhaps weather premium is added to price, keep in mind that it's a global market now, and we want to be very proactive in adding to current and forward sales on rallies. And so it's a challenging outlook, and we need to sort of change how U.S. agriculture operates over the next several years or decades. Hemp is just one of many. Hemp is ballooning in terms of production and demand. But what's most important about this is some market that is growing and not contracting like row crops are. So the total value of hemp should more than double in the next 2 years. The total demand for hemp-based products, such as CBD oil, is not expected to peak until 2025. And so I know this graphic is not terribly accurate in terms of we don't eat corn that we grow. But we can see on a per capita basis, the use of corn that we grow is going down. However, the market for CBD products is expected to explode in the next couple of years. And so I'm not saying that hemp is the solution for everyone or this specific market should be studied in depth, but it's just the idea that we need to grow things that are in high demand and where demand will be growing over the next several years. And so none of this has to change in the near term, but I want to plant the seed in the U.S. farmer's head that we just need to think more outside of the box and diversify, and that's what's going to keep everyone in business for the next generation and beyond. And so again, I thank you for the time. I hope you have learned something. And I'm sorry that I can't be there to field questions. But if you have any questions now or in the future, please send them to my email address, which is displayed here. I hope everyone had a wonderful meeting and has a wonderful rest of the evening, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.